Welcome to Patriot to the Core. I'm Thad Forester. This podcast exists because of my little brother, Mark Forester. He was angered by the attacks on 9/11, so he joined the military to help rid the world of terrorists. On September 29, 2010, he was killed on his first deployment. From his death notification to the dignified transfer ceremony, his viewing, funeral, and subsequent memorials, I was amazed at the new world of warriors we met. These patriots have become close to our family and been huge supports. They stood out because of their willingness to voluntarily fight evil. They believed in freedom. Because of their actions, I started this podcast to interview great Americans who serve their country and communities. Thank you for tuning in. Colonel, thanks for being with me. And I'm curious, though, it's amazing how often people kind of like come out of the woodworks. And here it is, almost 15 years after Mark's death, and you contacted me from Mark's website, markaforester.com. What was it that, and that was just, I don't know, just a few short months ago or a couple months ago. What was it that drew you to contact us? Because I don't think we had ever had any communication with you before.
No, I don't know what it was. I'm writing a new book right now, and in it, one of the mysteries of, and we'll talk about this, I think, later on, about the relationship between a close air support pilot and the JTAC, the ground controller. And yet, one of the magical things about it is the instant trust. I mean, when you check in, you call on the radio, and they say go with your fighter lineup, and you give them your fighter lineup, and just by the way you speak on the radio, and it was a big deal for us to sound professional, but the way you speak on the radio, the way you answer a couple of questions and ask questions at the very beginning, and also the way the JTAC talked, his tone of voice, his confidence, the way he talked determined the level of trust that you gave them. And I was not a JTAC, although I guess you could call me a JTAC, instructor, because I was a FAC-A, a forward air controller airborne. So I did the FAC role from the air, and so I understand what goes into it, and I just love that trust piece. And I was thinking back, I was going through my journal entries. So I didn't really keep a journal when I was deployed, but I wrote letters to the spouses every week. And I think I sent you a copy of those. And as
Mm-hmm.
I read through those letters, I came across the story of your brother, and I just remember vividly the emotion that went in that. I mean, it was very palpable in the squadron when we lost Mark, and none of us knew him. None of us knew his name. We knew him as Jag-28, and that was it. But then we started, information started trickling in as some of his squadron mates and teammates, came to Kandahar where we were, and we, talking to the unit, and but it was a very palpable feeling like you lost a brother. And so reading back over that, it made me think about it a lot, made me go to the website, and I thought, what, I'm gonna reach out.
I'm glad you did. I appreciate that. My family did. I shared with mom and dad and my brothers and sister that email that you sent me. But what about your early life? And how did that shape who you are and why you went in the military?
My dad was Air Force, and so I grew up bouncing around the country. He was a fighter pilot, and so I spent a lot of time around Air Force bases. And I really never, I remember when I was about 20, well, actually, 17, 18, and my dad said, if you want to go to college, you got to pay for it yourself. I'm like, all right, I got to find a free school. But I already kind of made up my mind. As a 12-year-old, I remember going to the Air Force Academy. It was for my dad's 20th reunion, as crazy as that sounds. And going there and looking at the cadets standing on the parade ground at attention for a long period of time and thinking that looks terrible, and having this feeling that it was what I was supposed to do. And I really never thought about doing anything else. I've got friends who got into, engineering, other forms of government service, and business, and on and on and on. And I never really, I tried to plan and think, what else would I do? and none of it really entered. None of it really interested me. I was going to go in, and then I went to the Air Force Academy. By luck, I got in, and my freshman year, or during basic training, they have you memorize the history of a bunch of heroes that went before, fighter pilots and bomber pilots from World War One, World War Two, Korea, and Vietnam, and you read their stories and you think, I want to be like one of those guys. That way, and I don't even know if I ever said I want to be like one of those guys, but I was drawn to the kind of life they led, and I was drawn to the kind of things they did, and not all of them were even necessarily great people, in the written word, but their acts were amazing, selfless, heroic acts, and so that always left an impression on me, and I thought that's what I'm supposed to do.
Did you, how does that work? Did you get a scholarship or how did you pay for it?
It's paid for by you and every other taxpayer. You get accepted, you get a nomination from your congressman, and then you get accepted to the academy, you get an appointment to the academy, and you're in the military. You're under the Uniform Code of Military Justice the day you swear in, and you can leave anytime you want during the first 2 years without incurring any debt. You're getting paid like half of what a young airman gets paid. So you're getting paid just enough to get in trouble. But then you pay for all your books, and you pay for all your uniforms, and you pay for, later on you had to pay for your computer. So you show up, and 2 months in, this is 1985, 2 months in, for my classmates that quit, they quit with a couple $1,000s in debt for all the things that they had to buy. And then slowly you pay off that debt, with your paycheck. And like my freshman year, I got $60 a month. That's what I saw in my paycheck. And then my sophomore year, I got 150, I think. And anytime you bought books, that dropped back down to 60. And then your junior and senior year, you've paid off most of your debt, so you've got a lot more flexibility on money, and you're still not making a lot, but you're making, all your expenses are paid for except for your phone bill, your girlfriend. So it's really a good deal. I mean, financially, there are actually easier ways to go to college, I think. But with scholarships and working your way through, because you don't get, I'd get 3 weeks off over the summer, so you're not able to get a job, you're not able to raise money, you can't have a job while you're in school. My average course load, and I was a history major. I had a major minor. I was a history major, and I averaged over 8 semesters, 21 hours a semester. And I've got my friends who were
That's a
engineering,
lot.
yeah, who were mechanical, aeronautical, astronautical engineering majors. They averaged 25, 26 hours a semester. I mean, it brutal. And I just wasn't that smart. I would have liked to have gotten an engineering degree, but I couldn't keep up with my peers because I wasn't their peer when it came to math and engineering, even though I liked it, quite a bit. And so you just didn't have time to do anything but hammer through school.
Mm. But did you have to commit at some point X number of years after you got out of the academy?
First day of your junior year, you're committed, and then I think you owe at that point. You sign on the dotted line, you go to class, first day of class, and you're committed for 4 years. And at that point, 4 years enlisted. And then once you graduate and get a commission, you take on a 5-year commitment as an officer. And then I went to pilot training. And so my pilot training commitment was 8 years after pilot training. So I delayed about 4 or 5 months to go to pilot training. And then I went to pilot training, so that year of training, at the end of that year, I had an 8-year commitment. And they've since upped it to 10 years after pilot training. So, when you graduate in pilot training, they own you for the next 10 years. So
Yeah.
you're already over the hump in terms of staying until a 20-year retirement at that point.
Okay. So in your career, you've flown the C-130, and I know these have I've never gotten into the E's and the letters at the end, but that may be a sticking point. You may be sensitive to that, but the C-130, the C-17, and the A-10, and I don't know if anything else. But if is there anything else, and then what were the most fun, and maybe the pros and cons of those for you?
I would say, as far as the letter at the end of it, that's really just kind of the when it rolled off the assembly line or the modernization, the upgrades that they've done to it. And I flew an A-10. I flew the A-10A model and then the A-10C model, but it was the same aircraft. The electronics, the weapon system, the weapons delivery system, and the sensor integration, that was all new. And that's why they changed the moniker to A-10C, but it was the same aircraft. A-10E, or I'm sorry, the C-130E, that's just an old plane. The ones
Okay.
that I flew, they had all flown in Vietnam. I think the newest one was a 1969 version, and this is 93 to 96. And so they were worn out airplanes when I got to them. And then the C-17, those are brand new airplanes. And I picked one up at the Long Beach factory. It had 12.6 hours on it. In fact, they handed us it's a DD Form 254, which is the contract between, McDonnell Douglas or Boeing and the United States Air Force. And it was, I can't remember, it was, $270 million or something like that for the aircraft. It was one of the earlier ones, and so the earlier ones were a lot more expensive. Um, as far as flying, and then other aircraft that I flew, an hour here and an hour there, but in terms of actually being qualified, it was just those three aircraft. I had my training aircraft. I had one flight in an F-15, which was a lot of fun, but nobody would ever call me an F-15 pilot, and they shouldn't. 'Cause, I mean, it's a plane's a plane in terms of flying it, but employing it's something different. And until you learn how to employ the aircraft, you can't really call yourself an F-15 pilot or A-10 pilot, whichever. Starting out the C-130, I always wanted to fly a fighter, and I graduated from pilot training. There were no fighters, so I got a C-130 to Little Rock, and um, so there's a bit of disappointment in my heart. And
Are you saying there were no fighter positions open? Is that what you mean?
yeah, the Air Force
Okay.
was literally spooling down from 134 fighter squadrons down to, at that point, dwindling down to probably 90 fighter squadrons in a matter of just a couple of years. So you're slashing pilots and slashing airframes. The A-10 community went from about 700 aircraft down to 420-ish aircraft in about a 2 year time span. So really cut a lot of aircraft. And so they just didn't have any slots. We were graduate pilot training. In my pilot training class, the top graduate got a fighter, the second graduate got a fighter. And normally you'll have like anywhere between a third and half of your class that get fighters, depending on where you are on the force. And out of 25 assignable pilots, we had two guys get fighters, and two people get fighters. And then so I took my C-130 and I went there, and it's a great airplane, and I loved it because it was a blue collar job that required a white collar education. You're moving pallets around, and I once had a boss. He said nobody cares about 5 pallets, which is how many pallet positions in a C-130, an old C-130, and really nobody in the world cares about it except for the end user, except for the person you're delivering it to, and they care a lot. But anybody else, like they just count on the crews to get it done. And I really liked that. You get out on the road and with the crew, and it was just you and the user, you and the cargo, and you as the crew worked through the problem. And I really enjoyed that. The airplanes were old and beat up and underpowered, but it was still a lot of fun to fly. And I'm grateful I got to fly that. And then the C-17, I would have stayed in the C-130, but there are no more C-130 follow-on jobs. So I applied to the C-17, got accepted to the program very early on. You had your initial cadre, which are the guys who stand up a program, and I was right after initial cadre. And a big group of us showed up, and the C-17 was an amazing marvel of an aircraft. I mean, it still is. The amount it could carry, the power, its speed, its climb performance, and really the functionality, for the loadmaster, the guy who's controlling why we have the aircraft, controlling the cargo in the back and configuring it was really easy to configure, much easier than the older aircraft, C-130 or 141, and even the C-5. And then an opportunity came up for me to go to an A-10, and most people thought I was crazy. Most people thought you're going to ruin your career because I was late. I was at the 8-year point at that point. You're going to ruin your career. You're going to be behind all your peers. You're never going to be looked at for promotion. You'll never get to command, any of those things. And my answer was, okay, thank you, but I'm still going to do it because it's what I've always wanted to do. So I applied for it, got accepted. And then, just after the 8-year point, right around the 8-year point, I went to A-10 training in Tucson. And then I flew the A-10 for the rest of my career. And the A-10 was, I had dreams about flying the A-10, and I got to it, and every single one of those dreams about how awesome it was were true. It was just a fun plane. I mean, never fast enough, but every pilot will tell you the plane they're flying is never fast enough, especially if you're going cross country or trying to get somewhere. You can never go fast enough. I don't know if you're that way when you're driving a car, you're like going 75. I'm like, you know what? It's really nice to go 95 right now. It's really nice to go just a little bit faster, right? And that's why I was in the A-10. But sometimes you didn't want to go fast. So when you're not trying to get somewhere, when you're just trying to do a job, then your speed really didn't matter to you. It was about being where you needed to be.
Yeah.
I love, but I love the A-10. I love everything about it. I love the challenge of the mission. I love flying by myself. I like working with the crew. I love flying by myself. And then as a flight lead, flying where you're leading other aircraft, you're still working as a flight, but you're flying by yourself. And if the aircraft is to get where it needs to be, it's completely on you. And that was good for my confidence, good for I think my own professional development. And then it was just flat out fun.
Going back to the C-17, I believe that's the aircraft that brought Mark and his teammate Calvin and another killed serviceman home to Dover. Does that sound right? And did you ever fly any designated transfers or angel flights?
I did not, because stopped flying the C-17 in 1998, end of 1998. We weren't in conflict at that point, and occasionally you'd still get that. I mean, we had conflict in the 90s, but not where it was a regular occurrence. I remember carrying home MIA remains that were no longer MIA from Vietnam. We went over there and picked up some remains from the Vietnam War and flew them home. And that's a very somber thing. And I'm sure it is for those C-17 crews. It's a big honor, that's for sure.
Yeah. So as far as the A-10, Derek, please, you're the first A-10 pilot that I've had, and I knew while Mark was deployed that he loved the A-10. Please, like, introduce me and us to the A-10 and the cannon and whatever you think that people would want to know about it.
But first thing I'll say is that the most important thing in an A-10 is the pilot and the mindset. As an A-10, when you fly an F-16 or an F-15E or any other bomb dropping aircraft, doing close air support is a hobby for you. It's not your primary job. You're doing it, and you want to help. And there's some great pilots who do that, great crew members who do that. But it's still one of many jobs. And in the A-10, your whole focus is the ground force. Whether you do combat search and rescue, or you're going out and picking up an isolated personnel, or that may be an air crewman or it may not be, but there's still a guy on the ground and or group of guys on the ground. And with everything else that we do, you're focused on the ground commander and the ground commander's intent, and you take it very seriously. Like my squadron, we had a kind of a vision when I was a commander, and it's pretty, even if it's not verbalized, it's very normal. World's greatest CAS, world's greatest close air support, because second best isn't good enough. Second best gets people killed. And so by taking the mission so seriously as really a sacred honor, guys on the ground, I think, can feel that. We weren't hobbyists. We weren't just showing up doing this as um, as our weekend duty job. This was something that we wanted to do, um, permanently, that we lived, we ate, we breathed it. We understood when they talked about ground force, ground scheme maneuver and all that. We trained to all that. We understood it. Back at home, we trained with a lot of the special forces teams. They would come to our ranges. We train with them. We'd go to their ranges and we train with them where we pre-brief before and you talk to them and then you fly with them. And afterwards, they'd come into the squadron bar and you debrief it. And so there's a kinship and a camaraderie that's a lot higher than with any other fighter community. And again, that's not to take away from great crew members in other aircraft, but it's not their single focus job. Whereas for us, single focus. So, I was talking about when you check in, you're talking to JTAC and you establish that instant trust. When it's a flight of A-10s checks in, Mark and his guys, they instantly assume we know what we're doing. They instantly assume that we're tracking where things are, the direction, and that we control our weapons. We know how to deliver ordnance better than anybody else. And we're also going to provide a 3D perspective while still recognize the ground commanders in charge, a 3D perspective and leadership from the air that helps make the JTACs better and help make the ground force that much better. So that's my opinion of it. And then you talk about the weapons. I mean, the A-10 from a bomb dropping perspective, if I'm dropping dumb bombs, not laser guided, not precision weapons, A-10 pilots train more than anybody else on that. And so they're going to be better than that. They're going to be better than anybody else with it. Most weapons that are dropped now are precision weapons, but still developing the coordinates, making the aircraft, if you can follow this, talk to the weapon so that the coordinates are sent to the weapon correctly, or guiding that weapon in. It's a serious skill set. Actually, when you finally hit the weapons release button, that's the easy part. But everything back to that, it takes a lot of practice and a lot of hours and a lot of understanding of your system and what the guy on the ground wants. When an A-10 guy shows up, in general, the ground guy will explain, the JTAC and the ground commander will explain the situation. And a good A-10 pilot, which I would say is most of them, are going to say, here's what I recommend. I recommend a laser guided bomb on that. Or why don't you guys just hunker down and I'll strafe, or let me put a couple of rockets down on that target. And just whatever you're carrying to give them, number one, it gives them a sense of comfort and confidence that you're no kidding tracking the fight and you're adding value. You're not just there to drop bombs and blow things up because that's cool. You're there to, no kidding, do what's best for the ground commander. And we do it all the time, so it makes us the best at it.
How often do you think there's maybe even like an unspoken mentality of any A-10 pilots that, hey, an officer and this guy on the ground is an enlisted guy? And do you think does that ever happen as a negative, to where there's maybe a hesitation to trust who's on the ground?
No, not at all. As I say, the JTAC's pink body is at risk, mine's not. And so he may have a heightened sense of awareness, and he may actually not be missing something because he's more at risk than I am in the aircraft. But my job is to calm him down, to help him out, and to do what's best for him. But it has nothing to do with rank. I mean, for me,
Now,
it never did. And for me, it never did. And nor I don't know of any other pilot where that was an issue.
yeah, good. That just popped in my head. But you bring up something really interesting, Derek, I hadn't thought about. I know the importance of tone and calmness, and especially in some of these really stressful situations. And I've heard plenty of Mark's personal helmet cam footage. But maybe you both, I can see how you, as the pilot, could help calm down him on the ground too. That seems like a part of your, I guess, what a good A-10 pilot would do.
You want him to function at his peak, and if he's stressed, you have your stress curve. You reach the peak, and then all of a sudden your performance starts going down. You want him back at the peak performance. You want him to be stressed to a point so that he's acutely focused, but you also want him to be at his best. And so anything you can do to make it seem like just another day, another training sortie, where he understands that he's going to be taken care of, that allows him to function at a higher level.
Yeah.
So,
So
and I don't know
some
that I was
basic.
always perfect at it. That's something that I was very much aware of. That the way I speak to him, how I treat him, the calm that I project, that all helps him to feel the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, so to get to some basics then, when you check in, is it did you normally, like, let's just say in our situations in Afghanistan or maybe Afghanistan and Iraq, was there always more than one A-10? Did y'all fly in pairs or groups, or could it be one at a
I always flew
time?
in pairs. I mean,
Pairs? Okay.
you'd fly in pairs. Sometimes you would separate. You'd peel one off to go get gas. I didn't really like doing that, but if you didn't want to lose, you know, what do you call it, persistent coverage, then you would call it yo-yo to the tanker. So one go to the tanker. But in general, you try and do things in pairs, or
Okay.
I never did it in combat, or we would do it in a four ship, Oh, I did it in combat where another two ship was on station and then I showed up. And so the four of us, jointly attacked a target.
With one JTAC?
The one JTAC, yeah.
Wow. Okay. About how long do you have before you have to refuel? Once you show up, how long can you work with that JTAC?
It depends on where you are in the sortie. The longest sortie I flew unrefueled, longest combat sortie I flew unrefueled was a 3.6 hour sortie. And that was pushing it in terms of gas. We were operating about 100 miles away from our base, and we were doing a special forces, a high value target mission. So we didn't actually point our nose at the ground or drop any weapons, but we were on station for about, uh, you know, just under 3 hours, I would say, and
Okay.
the entire time there. But we would try and, I think, we would get gas once in a 4 to 4.5 hour sortie. We'd go and get gas one time. So, like I said, a lot of it depends on when you show up on station. But if I show up on station with a full tank of gas, as long as weather is an issue for me to get home, then I would try and count about 2 hours of playtime.
And then I think you've mentioned at least three different types of ordnance. How many types can you and did you typically have?
Well, your standard sortie, you have 10 weapon stations, and you had a targeting pod on one. And, so you're taking up one of the weapon stations with your sensor. And then we would carry four 500-pound bombsmen. Sometimes it was a low yield 500-pound GPS weapon. So if you wanted to limit your collateral damage, it had a smaller warhead in there, and then you had a regular yield GPS weapon called a JDAM, and that was again a 500-pound class weapon. And then you could either carry two more of those, two more normal yield 500-pound weapons, or two laser guided bombs. So GBU-12 is what we carried. That's 500-pound bomb, and then you would carry a pod of rockets of seven white phosphorus rockets, and then you would have your full gun of 1,150 rounds of high explosive incendiary. I know when they were operating in Iraq and in Syria, they were also carrying, and sometimes we do this in Afghanistan, but for most of our targets, the weapons load I just explained to you is the easiest and most flexible. But you carry a GBU-31, which is a 2,000-pound bomb. That's a lot of boom. And then they started carrying laser guided rockets. I never fired a laser guided rocket, but they're pretty awesome weapons because it's just a relatively small weapon that you can guide on a moving vehicle. And then we carry Maverick missiles. And a Maverick missile is a 500-pound shape charge. It can either be laser guided, or once you let it off the rail, you'll have an electrical optical or infrared sensor on the nose of it, and you'll lock it up. You got it up in your screen. You'll lock up the target. You hit the weapons release button, and it comes off. You know, like a really like a freight train coming off your wing, and goes and hits the target. And a 500-pound one and an 800-pound one. A 500-pound one is a shape charge. It's designed to punch a hole in a tank, and they're pretty devastating what they'll do to a tank. And then the 800-pound one has a blast and a frag. I mean, something going 1,000 feet per second that weighs 800 pounds, even if doesn't have a penetrating warhead designed to punch a hole, it's going to make a mess of that target. And it's going to destroy a tank in short order, just because of the kinetic energy that it's carrying with it. And then you've got a large, 300-pound warhead on it.
We have footage of Mark's where I believe he called in 3 or 4 or 500 pound bombs on a cave.
Yeah.
And I've got one I know where they were calling in a JDAM or some JDAMs. And I guess so that's cool. That's all from A-10s, huh?
F-16s, all the other fighters and the bombers, they carry a lot of the exact same weapons. And, that's what the beauty of some of the weapons we carry is that they're interchangeable between the different aircraft. It's really 200 or a 500-pound class weapon or a 2,000-pound class weapon. The fusing can be different. Is it a proximity fuse where it's designed for people, where it's coming down at the ground and the proximity fuse goes off, so it blows up before it hits the ground, and it's more destructive against people? Or you can do an impact fuse where it's going to hit it and bury into the ground just a little bit. Or you can do a delay fuse where it's going to hit, like if you're dropping it on a couple-story building, you'll do the delay fuse, so it goes through that first floor, through the roof, and it falls whatever your delay is before it goes off. Like dropping weapons on a cave, there's a really good chance that they put a delay fuse on that.
And the pilot does that?
The pilot does it. It used to not be that way, but now they come joint programmable fuse. They can set the settings in their computer, and it'll tell the bomb how much to delay right there. So
that's awesome.
So it's you carry 4 JDAMs, and you've got 3 different fuse settings already baked into it. So it's almost like you're carrying 12 weapons because of the flexibility that it gives you.
Wow. Man, okay. That's good. So did you ever have any, or maybe would you want to share a close call you had, or a high stakes mission, or a time where you thought, this is it, or I just about screwed up big time?
I remember one time, it was early on in my combat career, if you will. We had just arrived in Afghanistan. I was an ops officer in a squadron, the second in command, and I had a brand new wingman on my wing, and they called us down to southern Afghanistan from Bagram, and there was a Scandinavian ground party, and they were taking heavy fire, and they were literally running for their lives. And so we showed up just in time to then roll in and do a couple of strafe passes. It's a pretty good feeling when you come off target and you know that there's a high chance that those guys would not be calling home that night had you not showed up and did what you did. And that's one that sticks out, probably because it was one of my first ones where I really felt like it mattered. And there were a couple of others similar to that. I didn't have, we had a lot of guys in our squadron that did some pretty heroic things. I never considered what I did all that heroic. It just, I showed up, I worked with the JTAC. He said, we're taking fire from this location. Can you take care of it? So we'd take care of it and then be about our business. I remember one time we were in the Helmand River province in south central Afghanistan, and mainly the Marines down there. And we were strafing enemy in that they were relatively close to the friendlies. They're within 100 meters of the friendlies, and we were rolling in and strafing. And the JTAC said, every time you roll in, the entire tree line lights up. They're all firing at you. And I remember, and my answer was, copy, because you just didn't even think, you're so focused on what you're supposed to be doing that I never once was worried about whether or not I was at risk. I mean, I was sitting in an A-10 going 300 to 400 knots. And I thought, well, if he can hit me, then it's a golden BB and good on him. But
What was your elevation?
as you're coming off target, probably around 1,000 feet off the ground, so
Oh,
for what he's firing, that's a tough shot. I mean, it ends up being a barrage fire where so many of them are firing, and we had a couple aircraft get hit where, yeah, they could get lucky and hit you, but I was never concerned about getting hit. And you're, quite frankly, you're so focused on, even if it had been something bigger, I don't know that I would have thought about it because you're so focused on what does a JTAC need me to do and where do they need
yeah.
to put my ordnance, and are the friendlies, are the friendlies safe right now? Are they able to maneuver the way they need to maneuver?
How often did you have a situation where the JTAC couldn't give you the position? He couldn't explain it, or he was under too much fire, or maybe the enemy was too close. Did you ever have that experience where maybe there was frustration, like, hey, I can't hit the target. I don't know where the target is for sure.
And that happened more than once. And sometimes you don't fire. So sometimes if they couldn't figure out exactly where the enemy is, we would do what was called a show of force, where I would just, you know, dive down on where we thought they were, and I would accelerate out to about 400 knots, just pedal as fast as an A-10 can go and fly over top of them and dump out flares over their position. And sometimes that was all you needed. They're taking fire. They can't exactly identify where they are. I'm like, let me get them to put their heads down a little bit. So I would fly over, and you end up flying right over their position at, 100 or so feet off the ground and dumping a bunch of flares out. And they didn't like the sound of the A-10. They didn't like any fighter, but they didn't like the sound of the A-10, or they didn't like, I'm sorry, I bumped my screen there. They didn't like the thought that he may know where I am. And so if you're able to get close and dump those flares out pretty close, then that was a way to handle a
Hmm.
situation like that.
What do the flares do?
Well, they're really self-protection flares. A hog carries, if you're just carrying flares, 480 of them. And so you dump out, 6, 8, 12 flares, or like a bundle of them. And it's a high intensity infrared heat source. I've had them hit the ground and catch things on fire before. And they're to decoy missiles. Say somebody shoots a missile at you, an infrared, a heat-seeking missile. The flares are to decoy the missile off of your position. But it also is, it's, I've never been there on the ground, but from what I'm told, and from talking to the JTACs, it's not a comfortable feeling when a fighter flies right over your head, and it's this loud noise of a jet flying right over your head and then dumping out, you know, hot on fire, little pieces of metal. It's enough to deter you and say, maybe we'll fight another day. So that was one approach. Sometimes it was, if we weren't exactly sure, I would put white phosphorus rockets down. White phosphorus rockets, they weren't for killing targets, they were for marking targets. And sometimes, like, I'd use them as a screen. Let's say that friendly force were retrograding, trying to get out of an area, and I'd throw down a line of white phosphorus rockets because you can't see through it, and it's hot burning phosphorus, and so they can't see through the smoke, and allow the friendlies to move out of the way. But it's also a way to, you're talking to the JTAC, you think you're looking at the right spot, you throw down a smoke, or you throw down a couple of smokes. I think, yeah, the fire's just to the west of your position, or the fighters, the enemy, are just to the west of where you threw down that smoke.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times we would have a video uplink, so they're on the ground with a effectively a TV, and they're watching what your sensor is showing them, and so you're moving your sensor around. They're kind of talking you through what they see, and you could do a talk on that way, where I'm looking over the canopy rail, I'm looking outside, and then I also know where my sensor is looking in relation to the ground underneath me. And I would start calling out references, and we would do kind of a handshake uh, communication to step our way into where the target is. It's a whole lot easier than it used to be in Vietnam, and even when I first started flying the A-10, when everything was visual, and you think, that JTAC's on the ground, hunkered down behind a Humvee or behind a building, and he doesn't have great line of sight of what's shooting at him. So to be able to share my video with him and for him to go, yep, there's my position. Rounds are coming from the northwest, and they're 7.62 rounds or something like that. Allows me to kind of look out. All right, 7.62 rounds. Let me go out anywhere from 250 meters to 1,500 meters and see what I can see, and start looking for muzzle flash, start looking for things, and then he can see that also and say, look, I see muzzle flash right there. That's where it is, and then that you can also go back to the white phosphorus if I'm not sure, and he's not sure exactly that is a target, or he is sure, but he's not sure what's around it. Putting a white phosphorus rocket down there, it's also going to shut up an enemy without all the potential destruction of 110 rounds of 30 millimeter or a 500-pound bomb or something else.
Yeah. So when you're strafing, is it 30 millimeters, and is it always 30 millimeters or something else? Okay. And that's that unique, that noise the A-10 makes when it fires that thing.
1,150 rounds is what the gun carries. The first second as it's spooling up, it's 55 rounds, or 50 to 55 rounds. The second second is 70 rounds, and it fires 70 rounds a second. And so a good burst is about 2 seconds. Anything more than that, you start overheating the barrel and destroying the rifling of the rounds, which means that you get a whole lot less accurate.
Thinking about people listening that are wanting to maybe go in the Air Force, be a combat controller, or to be a JTAC. Would you elaborate a little bit more on what you had said at the beginning about the confidence and that relationship? I mean, what advice would you give to someone wanting to be a JTAC?
I think, again, I was never a JTAC on the ground, just the fact, but as a JTAC, and the ones I worked at the weapons school for a while, where they were doing the weapons school stand up of the JTAC course, and very, very professional. I remember thinking so many times, and your brother kind of falls in this category. I mean, he could have easily had a wife and 2 kids at home on senior airman pay and been eligible for food stamps, so not making a lot of money. And yet the purpose that they felt and the sense of professionalism, across the board in those guys was amazing to me. And I think it's because they understood, you're with the ground force, like Mark, he's out with an A-team, and he is their link to air power, and he is their link to airborne sensors, and he is their link to all that is good about Air Force and air power. And yet he also is a fighter with the rest of them. I mean, Mark is a great example. He was killed in action side by side with the guys on his team. And so he was very much part of the team, and yet he was a key element of the team that made the team function that much better. He was a force multiplier. That's a lot of responsibility to give to a relatively young serviceman. Mark was a little bit older, but there are plenty of senior airmen who are 21 years old doing exactly what he was doing. And to me, that's just amazing that we give them that level of responsibility. So it's that sense of purpose, that sense of belonging on a team, and having a role that nobody else can do. I mean, somebody else may, I'm sure that at some point he got called Air Force, the Army guys, they're always making fun of Air Force and how easy we have it. But they would never want to go to war without him. They would never be on the ground without their JTAC. And they recognize the value of that. And I mean, if you're not sure about being in the Army, but you like a lot of things about the Army, you want to be something unique and different, being a JTAC is phenomenal. And what Mark did as a combat controller JTAC, where he's a special forces JTAC, that's a step above. That's even better. And I will say this, I think you had a question that you sent me earlier. I love working with all JTACs. I've got a plaque that lists in the 6 months I was deployed, every single JTAC call sign that we worked with, and it's over 100 call signs. And and behind every call sign is a unit. Behind every call sign is anywhere from an A team to a battalion, and just a lot of responsibility. And I loved working with those guys. But anytime I checked in, or anytime I was assigned to work with a Jaguar, I knew I was getting a higher echelon JTAC. I knew that, a lot of the JTACs, they lived in the talk and they sat right next to the ground force commander, and they were not out in the weeds on the ground in the streets. And it wasn't that they weren't where they weren't supposed to be. It wasn't that they weren't doing a good job, but the level of risk that they were facing was not as high. You take a Jaguar or another JTAC that is in the streets with the team, with the company, with whatever unit it is, and they're carrying, not only are they carrying all their ammo and their water, but they're also carrying their embitter's radios, all the other radios that they had to carry, and setting up their antenna and making sure the comms are good and carrying their rover display with them. And so they're fighting like an infantryman, but they're also that link. And it's a pretty cool, it's pretty high level of professionalism that goes into something like that. So I would highly recommend. If I couldn't fly, and it wasn't an option when I first got in the Air Force, officers couldn't go and do that. Officers can do it now. But if it had been, back in 1991 when I was commissioned, if I was unable to fly, I think that's what I would have wanted to do. Knowing what I know now, that's what I would have wanted to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, would you share any of your interactions with Mark, maybe your first one or any of them?
I worked with him just one time. It was always quiet, nothing significant. Other guys in my squadron worked with him more so. Another pilot who I deployed with twice, he was on as the tick had been opened, the troops in contact had been opened, and he was not on site with Mark's team, and they were beating feet to get there when the word went out that they had KIA. And so he showed up too little too late, but a lot of them had worked with him. And like I said, it says a lot about Mark, the connection, because this was on, I think, like September 29th or September 28th. You probably know the date better than mine.
29th.
We had been in country for about 12 days. And to have worked with a JTAC for just that amount of time, and to have developed a kinship with them that quickly, because there were other KIAs when we were deployed. Other folks were killed in action while we were there, but none of them affected us the way that one did. And so, like I said, I don't have any recollections that I really think are worth sharing here of working with them. Guys in my squadron did, and it meant a lot to them. I have a lot of guys in my squadron have a Jag 28 bumper sticker on their trucks, on their cars. And they wear the t-shirts because, that was for some of them, that was their first combat deployment, and that was the first time they had dealt with death of a brother of theirs, and which is how they considered it.
What about the Jaguar? I didn't know if that was all combat controllers that were JTACs, or if that was maybe. Can you tell me how did you get the Jaguar call sign?
It was the Special Forces. Not all Special Forces JTACs were Jaguar. There were other. You had the different tiers of Special Forces teams and what they're working on, and the real high value targets. They generally were not the Jaguar call sign. The Jaguar call sign went to the JTAC, which was the combat controllers, which were embedded with the A teams, who were the ones who were doing the foreign internal defense, working with the Afghan National Army. They're the ones who are going through the village every day, meeting with the village elders, who are really in the streets, in the villages on a regular basis.
Okay.
They're the ones who are more at risk. You have I call it big green, big army, where you have a company goes out, or a battalion goes out, or a brigade goes out into a village, and they come with everything but the kitchen sink in terms of their force. And then you have the Jaguar elements, or the Green Beret, with working with the locals, and then having your combat controller JTACs with them. And so they were JTAC. So I can't give you a definitive answer, but of all my experience, when you check in with the JTAC, like that's a combat controller. That's a combat controller, and he's with an A team. And,
Okay.
and so that's so you knew you were working with a smaller team. You knew they were in Indian territory, and that they were going to be much better. I would say more aggressive, but more assertive in their actions as a JTAC. And the ground commander was more assertive in his actions as a ground commander.
Are you aware of that TV show that Lifetime did, the series years ago called Coming Home, and the episode on Mark?
No, I never saw it.
So there's I thought of this because of what some people said to me after, but it's called Coming Home. They actually had two seasons, but the first season, what they did is they filmed happy reunions of service members coming home and surprising their families.
Uh-huh.
But they did an episode on Mark. I think it was the fourth episode, and it aired in March of 2011. Anyway, you can find it online, and Mark's episode is called "Paying Tribute," I believe. And there's like two or three little B stories in there, and then Mark's is the main story interwoven throughout the hour. And but it's the one of the F-18 Hornet pilots that was overhead when Mark was killed, and it's him meeting our family and bringing a flag that he had in his cockpit flying, when Mark was killed. But he explained in there too. So it was really good for just the average person to kind of understand you've got somebody on the ground, you got somebody in the sky, and they've got to be able to know where to shoot. And that relationship between Mark and the pilot. So that was pretty cool because I had people ask me, he's like, man, I never thought about that, but that makes sense. I didn't know that's how this worked. So it's the show is kind of has a cheesy element to it, but that episode was a little different, and it was pretty cool to be a part of.
I just wrote it down. I'm gonna have to look it up.
Yeah, we joked that Mark would love to be on Lifetime, I'm sure, because of your career, maybe even because of even deploying to combat zones and in combat situations. But how has that improved, helped you to be a better person in all these different areas of your life, as a leader, as a consultant, as a church leader, as a father, a husband, those kind of things? What's the impact been?
Well, one, I'm more reflective about things. I have not, like I said, I went back and read all those letters, and I think, like, my relationship with my kids, thinking about them. I mean, when you're doing that, you're so mission focused and you're so job focused. Uh, I feel like I let my kids down because I wasn't there for them, and it wasn't that I shouldn't have been doing what I was doing. I was so focused on what I had, and they were struggling in a bunch of different ways. I mean, and I won't go into that now, but they were struggling in a bunch of different ways, and I wasn't able to see that. But in retrospect, it's helped me a lot, and it's changed the way I interact with my kids, and it's also changed the way, I'm grandfather age now. I don't have any grandkids, but I've got a lot of kids that live around me and stuff in my church group, and it's changed the way I talk to them. I think back on, just like the relationship between a cast pilot and a JTAC, and it's taught me a lot about how key it is to, as quickly as possible, develop trust in the team that you work with, and ask myself, how do I develop that trust? How do I show that trust? How do I give that trust? And then if that trust is ever broken for some reason, let's see that, in flying, JTAC gives me bad coordinates, or I drop a bad bomb or something like that. How do I reestablish that trust? Because we're always going to make mistakes. I've made plenty of mistakes in the cockpit and otherwise. We're always going to make those mistakes, but how do we then reconnect with that trust? And then that takes me to my role as a father and a consultant and whatever else. I spoke earlier this week at a conference, and I kept saying, why are all my stories, as I'm speaking, even I'm like, all my stories are about my combat experience. And my combat experience wasn't that remarkable. I mean, it was, but yet, thousands of other people have done what I've done. Uh, but it's so refining and defining because of the importance of it, that I think, like I was talking about the stress curve, the stress involved and the importance of it, you feel it, you sense it, you lose people, that you pay attention a lot more. And so it's taught me to pay attention when it really matters, but it's also taught me to look for areas where I'm not paying attention, but it also matters. And so, I mean, I never would say I want to go to war, but I'm grateful. If you look at the big scheme of things and why we're on this earth, to become better people, it made me a better person. It made me better at, caring about how I react to other people, how I act towards other people, caring about how professional I am, how much time and effort I put into things that I'm entrusted with. And it makes me grateful for the people that I've worked with. I met a lot of really great people, preparing for combat and while in combat. And I often say that some of the most uncouth people I met were probably, compatriots to your brother. And, I saw it a lot in special forces. We worked a lot with special forces, and a lot of them were not the most savory individuals in terms of when you look at, you pull out the 10 Commandments and what defines a good, upstanding person. And sometimes I think those people, they're ahead of me in line, because they when they give their life like that, and how I need I need all the instruction and the bumpers to keep me on track and to teach me step by step. They already know what's most important. They already know the true value of a life and the true value of giving of themselves. They don't need the commandments. Excuse me. They don't need the commandments as much as I do, and the direction as much as I do. And I'm not excusing any kind of behavior or anything like that, but I came to really see individuals as really, and there's no real other word for it, but godlike in their instant willingness to give their life for somebody else.
Yeah. You really described that well. I've thought about that many times because of the relationships that we have now and the people that we've gotten close to, and maybe the kind of people that live different lives than me, but man, they're willing to die for people they don't know, for their teammates, and to do things that most people won't do. So I have tremendous respect, and it's definitely helped me to not be so like quick to judge.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been very blessed and with the guidance I've received in my life and the opportunities I've received, and I try to live a good life. But I recognize there are people that have had a different life, a different path, that are just as good or better than me, even if their standards are different or their approach to life is different from me, and they've proven it many times over. Like, the example that I'm using, where they're willing to give their life in an instant for somebody they don't even know. I mean, we lost a lot of lives in Afghanistan for a country that ultimately imploded on itself. And uh, and I think, why would they do that? And because geopolitically, you could say they wasted their lives, but they didn't. They they demonstrated what is the best in humanity in what they did.
That's right. They did. Anything else that you like to say in closing?
I'll share this one because I think it'll mean something to you, and I'll probably get emotional out of it. When Afghanistan fell apart in 2021, I talked to a lot of my friends who are, veterans with me from that war, and it devastated us. I was emotionally crushed by it because I thought I wasted, because this is about the time when I'm starting to kind of, introspectively think through my own family and the time I spent away from my kids. And I spent a lot of time training to go, then preparing to go, and then going, and then coming back. And I missed a lot of Christmases and birthdays and different events. And even if I was there, I wasn't focused on them because of where I was going. And my sacrifice was minimal compared to a lot of other people. A lot of other people spent a lot more time over there than me. And so it crushed me that it was such an abject failure politically, and made me angry, but really just really devastated me. And then we had a couple of months after that, this refugee service here in Salt Lake called us and said, "Do you have room in your house for an Afghan girl?" And I immediately knew that the answer was yes, because it was almost like I failed, or we failed as a nation to get anything good out of that conflict. But if she can come here and have a better life and have a safe life and develop and learn about freedom, then it's worth it. And it's true. She's lived with us, off and on for the last, 4 years. And it's been a huge blessing to see her develop as a person, and she's got a ton of scar tissue and PTSD that I can't even imagine for things that she went through to get out of the country. And yet there's her, and there are other people like her that do have a better life, that can soon call themselves Americans because of the efforts that we put in, while we were there. And it didn't save everybody, and the majority weren't saved. And we lost a lot of good American blood over there in trying to save those few lives. But I'm sure that the people who gave their lives would say, if Marwa, that's the girl's name, and these other people can have what I had and can experience the freedom that I had, then I'll do it again.
Thank you. And my family thanks you for keeping many of our guys alive and for protecting Mark and his team so many times. So thanks for trusting him.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and it's an honor to know a little bit more about his family. And I would just say this last thing, it was remarkable after he passed, hearing bits and pieces from his team as we interacted with his team, and then the other JTACs from the Combat Control Squadron, the Special Tactics Squadron, and learning about who he was as a person. It 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 made it hurt a little bit more, but it also made us focus more on doing our job to the best of our ability.
Mhm. And I meant to ask you, Derek, how did you find out Mark's name?
I can't even remember. I mean, he's JAG 28, and I'm sure it was as his remains were transported to Kandahar, and then from there, transported out. I'm sure it had to do with our interaction with the STS and his commander and the leaders that were there to take care of him. And then we heard about, and I think it's some of the pilots in my squadron reached out, more so, and we heard about the memorial service and everything else. And again, I really don't know how I got as much information as I did, but I was honored to learn more about him as I learned more.
Well, God bless you.